room was cold, not just because of the air conditioning humming softly in the background, but because of the tension that thickened the air like a heavy fog. Gabriel sat in the dimly lit office, his hands clasped together as he watched the man in front of him squirm. He said nothing. It was remarkable how silence could suffocate someone faster than a scream. The man, James Holloway, was once a ruthless executive, feared, respected, untouchable. But now, he was unraveling under the weight of his own guilt. Gabriel had learned something over the years. Words were weapons, yes, but silence? Silence was a blade that cut deeper, left no trace, and made the victim destroy themselves. James gulped. "Listen, Gabriel lifted a single finger. Not a word. James swallowed his breath, his face contorting with desperation. He wanted an answer, a reaction, anything that would make this moment feel less like a slow descent into madness. But Gabriel wasn't here to give him relief. He was here to make him drown in his own thoughts. This wasn't about revenge. No, revenge was too simple, too direct. Gabriel had something else in mind, a punishment far worse than physical pain. Because the moment you stop reacting, the moment you refuse to feed their ego with anger or despair, that's when you win. That's when they start falling apart, piece by piece. And James? He was already crumbling. James shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the armrest. A nervous tick of a man who once commanded boardrooms with a single glare. But now, under Gabriel's silence, he was nothing more than a man drowning in his own panic. "Say something," James finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel just leaned back, his gaze steady, unwavering. It was almost amusing. The way people begged for confrontation, for screaming matches, for outbursts of rage. They wanted to know where they stood, what to expect. But silence was an abyss. It forced them to wrestle with their own demons, their own guilt. James's breathing grew uneven. "You think this is going to break me?" he scoffed, forcing a smirk. "I've dealt with worse. I've buried men who thought they could scare me." Gabriel remained motionless, his expression unreadable. James was lying, of course. He wasn't as untouchable as he liked to believe. He had spent decades building an empire off the backs of others, making enemies in the process. Some had tried to take him down through legal means, others through brute force. None had succeeded, but Gabriel was different. He wasn't interested in playing by the rules of war. He was here to dismantle James, piece by piece, without ever laying a finger on him. James let out a humorless laugh. "All right, I get it. The silent treatment. Real mature." He rubbed his temples. "You think you're some kind of mastermind, don't you? You think you're in control here?" Still, Gabriel said nothing, because he didn't need to. James's confidence wavered for just a second, but it was enough. He shifted forward, suddenly restless. His leg bounced. His hands twitched. He cleared his throat more times than necessary. That was the thing about silence. It wasn't just empty space. It was a mirror. It forced people to hear their own thoughts, confront their own fears, replay their own sins. And James had many. Gabriel knew exactly what was running through his head. He could see it, the paranoia creeping in, the ghosts of past betrayals whispering at the edges of James's mind, the realization that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. James leaned in, trying to gauge Gabriel's expression. "All right, enough of this bullshit. You came here for a reason. What do you want?" Gabriel blinked. Once, slowly. James exhaled sharply. Fine. I see how it is. You think you can shake me? You think silence is enough to break me?" He laughed, but it was hollow, forced. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Gabriel tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a scientist might study a rat in a maze. James wasn't used to this. He was used to threats he could counter, accusations he could twist, opponents he could buy off or crush beneath his heel. But this was something else. Gabriel reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object, and placed it on the table. A simple voice recorder. James stared at it, his face darkening. "What is this?" Gabriel pushed play, and suddenly, the room wasn't silent anymore. A voice crackled to life. James' voice. "I don't care what happens to them. The factory workers are replaceable. Cut their wages. If they don't like it, they can starve." James paled. Another recording followed. "Bury the reports. We don't need the feds sniffing around. Pay off whoever needs paying off. And if anyone talks, make them disappear." The color drained from James's face. His breath hitched. His hands trembled ever so slightly before he curled them into fists. Gabriel finally spoke. "You talk too much." James shot up from his seat, rage flashing in his eyes. "You son of a—" Gabriel simply leaned back, quiet, unmoved. James froze. He had fallen into the trap. Gabriel didn't need to scream. He didn't need to make threats. All he had to do was show James the weight of his own words. Let him hear his own sins playing back at him. Because silence wasn't just about withholding words. It was about forcing the other person to fill the gaps with their own guilt, their own paranoia, their own destruction. James sat back down, his movements slower this time, his breathing ragged. The realization was setting in now, cold, heavy, inescapable. Gabriel slid the recorder across the table. "It's funny," he mused. "You spent your whole life making people feel powerless. And now, look at you." James swallowed. His gaze flickered to the recorder, then back to Gabriel. He wanted to say something, anything to regain control. But what could he say? Because now, it was his silence that was killing him. Gabriel rose from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket. "Enjoy the silence, James," he said calmly. "It's the last thing you'll hear before your world falls apart." And with that, he walked out, leaving James alone, with nothing but his own fear. James sat there, frozen, staring at the recorder as if it were a live grenade in his hands. His mind raced through every possible scenario, every way out, every thread he could still grasp onto to keep his empire from crumbling. But there were none. Gabriel had given him no demands, no ultimatums, no negotiations, just silence and the cold, inescapable weight of the truth. James's hands clenched into fists. He had clawed his way to the top, crushing anyone who dared stand in his way. He had always believed power belonged to those who were ruthless enough to take it. But now, sitting alone in his dimly lit office, he realized something he had never understood before. Real power didn't come from force. It came from control. And silence was the most brutal form of control there was. He reached for his phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. "Vincent, I need you to take care of something." Discreetly. A pause. Then Vincent's voice came through, cautious. "James, take care of what, exactly?" James exhaled sharply, his patience already thinning. "You know exactly what I mean. I need leverage. I need to know who this man really is, where he came from, and how to erase this mess before it spreads." Another pause. Vincent hesitated, and that hesitation was the final sign James needed. Even his own men were starting to doubt him. James gritted his teeth. "I pay you to get things done. Do it." But even as he barked the order, something gnawed at the back of his mind. Gabriel wasn't like his past enemies. He wasn't interested in blackmail, money, or deals. No, Gabriel had walked in like a ghost from the past, like a force of nature, unstoppable, unshakable, silent. And that was what terrified James the most. The days that followed were suffocating. James felt the silence closing in around him, tightening like an invisible noose. No messages from Gabriel, no threats, no further moves, just silence. And then, slowly, the cracks began to form. The first was a simple email, a leaked report from an anonymous source, exposing years of embezzlement within his company. A journalist had picked it up, and by morning, it was all over the financial news. The second came in the form of an internal leak. Half his board of directors suddenly resigned, their silence speaking louder than any public statement ever could. Then the third crack, his wife left, without a word, no screaming, no argument, just an empty closet, a missing wedding ring, and a note that simply read, "I always knew this day would come." James was unraveling. For the first time in his life, he was powerless, not because he lacked resources, but because there was no enemy to fight. Gabriel had become a ghost, a presence that haunted every moment, every thought, every second of silence. And James realized this was the real punishment. Not death, not ruin, but the slow, torturous collapse of his world, piece by piece, with no one left to scream at, no one to blame, just himself. One evening, after days of spiraling, James found himself in the very chair where Gabriel had sat, staring at the same empty seat where he once sat in control. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. The weight of everything had settled onto his shoulders like 1,000 bricks. The recorder still sat on the desk, unmoving, silent. It was then that James understood. Gabriel hadn't destroyed him. James had destroyed himself, because the greatest weapon wasn't fire or fists or fury. It was silence. And in the end, his own silence had broken him in ways anger never could. Gabriel, miles away, sat in the back of a quiet cafe, watching the news unfold on his phone. The empire James had built was crumbling in real time. Investigations, betrayals, scandal after scandal. He simply took a sip of his coffee. No words, no victory speech, just silence. Because in the end, that was all he ever needed. The silence had already won.